Hi and welcome to this video about tips to travel cheap. And as you know, I travel a lot, and probably most of you think that I have way more money than I have. Most of people who I tell that I've been to this country and that country, they think that I had a lot of money to pay for that. But this is actually absolutely not true, and if you knew how I travel, I spent almost no money on that. I mean, I spent money on that, but it's like nothing comparing to what people think you have to spend on traveling. And let's move over to the tips for cheap traveling. So one of my most important tip that always helps me like a lot is a tip to consider alternative routes to some place. Which, for example, if you have like, for example, you want to fly from city A to city B and the flight is expensive, you can do this in multitudes of ways. You can, for example, fly there by plane, like traditional way, like from one place to another. You can take a bus, but also you can go through other cities which are like maybe not directly on the way, or maybe even some city that is like further from that but has cheaper flights. Like sometimes you just fly for a different place that has, like, you think, oh, makes no sense, but then you have a cheap flight from that city to the place where you want to go. For example, I once went for 10 euros to Jordan from Brussels, and I did it like I went to Brussels, and from Brussels I went to Milan for 5 euros, and from Milan I had a flight to Jordan for 5 euros, and that's how I did it. And it takes more time. It's not good if you need to like if you care a lot about your comfort, about, for example, not sleeping at the airport or something. But if you want to travel cheap, then you have to not care about your comfort that much. I mean, it depends what's more important to you, saving money or being able to sleep in a bed. Because back then I had to spend a night at the airport, and it happens to me a lot of times. But that's not the worst thing. The worst things are airports that close at night and you cannot sleep there, and you have to find a hotel which is expensive, and I hate it, honestly. Like, airports shouldn't ever close at night. Airports are at least warm. They are like very warm. Like I'm always cold at the airport if I sleep there, but they are warmer than outside. They have a bathroom, they usually have somewhere to charge your phone, so it's like, you know, it's much better than sleeping outside. So if I can, I very often sleep at the airport if I don't have to find a hotel. Yeah, you can consider alternative routes. And when it comes to finding like cheap connections, I always think about, for example, if there's a high demand for this flight. For example, there are some countries that have a lot of connections and they are usually cheap. Like, for example, a lot of people from this country live in that country, so they fly a lot between those two countries. Like, for example, there's a lot of flights to Balkan countries from Germany, and a lot of people, like, for example, from Bosnia, from Kosovo, from Macedonia, they live in Germany. So I thought, oh, maybe from Germany there will be a lot of flights to those countries, and there are a lot of flights to those countries from Germany. That's very often the case when you have a lot of immigrants from that country in another country. Like, also there's a lot of cheap flights to Morocco from Spain. There's a lot of Moroccan people in Spain. Like, there's a lot of Moroccan people in different countries, but in Spain, not in all countries those flights are cheap somehow. Like, for example, here in Netherlands they are more expensive, even though we have a lot of Moroccan people, but the flights are not cheap. But it's often the case, not always, but it's often the case that if a lot of people are flying back and forth between those countries, there are some very cheap connections. Also, a night bus. Another option is to consider a night bus. And if you want, for example, to not pay for a hotel, which is sometimes very expensive in some countries, you can take a night bus and you spend a night somewhere because you spend it on a bus. And you also travel at the same time, so you don't have to pay double for a transport from one city to another and for a night in a hotel, because you have both of those things in one thing. And honestly, I love sleeping on buses. Like for me, it depends on the bus, because sometimes it's like a perfect sleep, and sometimes it's like, sometimes I just feel so uncomfortable, or often I feel, I feel cold on a bus. So it's like not always a perfect option, but sometimes I sleep just perfectly. So that's another thing that I like to do, because it saves a lot of money. And also another tip of mine is to memorize the cheap connections, because even if you don't need some connection, for example, you don't need to fly to Vienna right now, but you maybe will at some point. It's good to memorize where is it cheap to fly to that place from, and those even though prices fluctuate a bit, like usually if there are a lot of cheap connections from one place to another, they will appear like more often. Sometimes it changes a lot, but sometimes they actually, you know, actually you can memorize that from that place to that place it's usually cheap, and it's easy to find flights from that place to another place for a cheap price. And another tip, tip number 4, is looking for an occasion, and this is quite obvious. So when it comes to for example, flights, like I think the prices differ the most, because if you book a flight just before the flight, it can be very expensive, and if you book like a few months in advance, it can be very cheap. You should look for occasions, and sometimes there are, for example, tickets for 10 euros from one city to another city. And by the way, sorry, but I live in Europe, and most of those things, they are very most of those tips you can use like everywhere, but a lot of those tips I'm talking about European places, because for me, like, the cheapest travel is the travel they have in Europe. Europe is not the most interesting continent for me. Like, I don't like Europe that much, but if I want to travel cheap, like, but I also apply those rules to countries that are outside of Europe. Like, for example, when I fly to a country outside of Europe, I often go to Sarajevo, because from Sarajevo you can fly to Abu Dhabi and quite cheap, and from Abu Dhabi you can fly quite cheap to a lot of Asian countries. So but most of the things that I say, a lot of those things, they apply to Europe, because I live there, and in Europe you have a lot of cheap connections between different European cities, like especially, for example, Milan. Milan has like 3 airports, and I don't remember exactly which airport has like cheapest flights. London often has very cheap flights, Dublin, Warsaw, yeah, like those cities, they often have very cheap flights. Also Brussels sometimes. So another tip that I have is looking for alternative means of transport, and these are, like, for example, BlaBlaCar instead of a bus, or even hitchhiking. But hitchhiking, for me, for example, I don't have enough patience to hitchhike in Europe, because in Europe, like, nobody stops. So yeah, for example, when it comes to hitchhiking, for example, in Arab countries, people stop, and it's like, I recommend, because I tried it a few times, just stopping a random person and telling them that I want to go somewhere. Always worked out, like, perfectly, seriously. Like, in Arab countries, you can do that all the time, but in Europe, you probably have to wait many hours, and maybe you can do that, but for me, like, my patience doesn't allow that, because, like, I don't want to stand in the cold for a few hours. So for me, it's just not for me. So another tip, tip number 6, I think, is to sleep in a room for many people instead of a room for one person. And not everybody does that, because some people, for example, they are afraid of sleeping in a room for many people. There are, for example, like, female only rooms, and these are the only ones in which I sleep, because I'm afraid of not sleeping in female only. Some people use, for example, couch surfing, which is like sleeping for free in, you know, some people that you met at some people's place that you met online. But honestly, because I made a lot of creeps during all of my trips, I'm a bit afraid of using that, and I cannot recommend, because I never used that myself, so I just don't know. And I don't know if I would be able to fall asleep if, for example, I wouldn't be able to just lock myself lock my room and just know that nobody is going to come. And I don't know if it's somebody's apartment, so I don't know if I recommend or not, because I never tried it myself. But you can sleep in rooms for many people, especially if you are in some expensive city. And for example, where I live, like most of hotels, they are ridiculously expensive, so I do that. And another tip that I have is eating at bakeries instead of eating at restaurants. This is of course not not then you can go to a bakery and it's much cheaper than a restaurant. So another tip number 8 is to look to realize which cheap airways, like which cheap companies like you have in your area and area in which you're interested. Like for example, in Europe there's Ryanair and Wizz. Look if there are any like flights to cities or areas that interest you, because sometimes there are very good occasions, and there are like some airlines are cheaper than the other ones. So it's like, yeah, so the point number 9 is to combine different destinations. If you, for example, are going in same direction, you can at once see this place and that place instead of coming back later. For example, if you pay a lot of money to fly to Thailand, then you can also go to Vietnam if you want to go to Vietnam, because if next time you want to fly to Vietnam, you also will have to pay this large sum of money to fly there. And from Thailand to Vietnam it's like much cheaper because it's close. So like myself, I really like combining destinations. Like I know people who, for example, like seeing only one country in one trip because they don't like combining destinations. For them it's too much. But for example, I really like combining destinations, and I think that's a waste of money to not combine them sometimes. So yeah, that was the point 9. And the point 10 is quite obvious. It's going to some place outside of a season and outside of the time when it's like the most expensive. Always look if there's like a possibility to go in a less expensive time period, because sometimes like those season is much more expensive than not in season. But you should also look at the places that you want to see, if they are also like, for example, if you want to go to some place and it's not possible to go there like in summer season at all, because for example it's mountains and there are avalanches or something like this. So that's also important. So yeah, that was the 10 points of traveling cheap, and see you next time. Bye.